Hello everyone, and welcome to Casa Nightmare. In this episode, I'm going to share with you 5 really short, scary bedtime stories. So without further ado, let's get started. In the early 1960s, Mr. and Mrs. Scott moved into an old house in Cleveland, Ohio, with their 5 young children and pet dog. Upon settling in, an eerie atmosphere surrounded the back bedroom. The children steered clear of it, and even the family dog refused to enter. The small room housed only a bed and a built-in closet in one corner. Mr. Scott, working nights at an assembly plant, would retire to the secluded space upon returning home in the morning, assuming it would offer him peace and quiet. However, his nights in that room were anything but. Mr. Scott was plagued by intense nightmares that felt disturbingly real. These dreams were so terrifying that he would often wake up in a panic, trembling with fear. In one particularly horrifying nightmare, he envisioned opening the closet door only to have a bloodied and mutilated woman's body tumble out. As time passed, his nightmares intensified, leading to severe sleep deprivation and exhaustion. Consequently, he decided to move back to the master bedroom with his wife, which surprisingly resulted in the cessation of the disturbing dreams. However, when his mother visited and stayed in the back bedroom, she experienced a terrifying night filled with unsettling noises that left her visibly shaken. Convinced that something malevolent resided in that room, she promptly cut short her visit and returned home. Mr. and Mrs. Scott had no choice but to acknowledge that there was something strange going on with the back bedroom. When an old family friend stayed overnight in the same room, he was roused from his slumber by the sensation of being turned over. Blinking groggily, he saw a figure standing outside his bedroom door. A woman with cascading locks of hair, with her back to him. Clad in a short fur coat and a blue dress, she stood there, motionless. Driven by curiosity or perhaps an inexplicable force, he rose and advanced towards her silhouette. All of a sudden, darkness enveloped the house as every light extinguished. Disoriented, he fumbled through the blackness until the lights came back on and mysteriously found himself in the kitchen. Mrs. Scott was there at the sink, washing dishes. Then a sudden otherworldly wail pierced the air, rendering both of them speechless with dread. A noxious odor permeated the room as a heavy trap door within the kitchen floor began to creak open and slam shut repeatedly. Terrified, they contacted the authorities. Several police officers conducted a thorough search of the entire house, but their efforts yielded no findings. The following day, upon Mr. Scott's return from work, he was met by his wife and friend who recounted the unsettling events of the previous night. However, Mr. Scott remained skeptical of their claims. That night, he opted to sleep in the rear bedroom. As he was on the brink of falling asleep, he sensed movement in the room. Assuming it was his wife, he called out to her but received no response. When he turned to investigate, he was confronted by a grotesque visage mere inches away from his face, an image so horrifying that it surpassed any prior experiences. The eyes seemed to gaze through him while the mouth attempted to speak but emitted only a menacing hiss, accompanied by a putrid odor. Mr. Scott burst out of the rear bedroom in a state of sheer panic, his eyes wide with terror and his screams piercing the air. Frantically tearing at his hair, he dashed through the room, evading his friend's attempts to restrain him. In a frenzied state, Mr. Scott lashed out, kicking and resisting any form of control. Eventually, with the combined efforts of his wife and friend, they managed to subdue him by wrapping him in a blanket and bringing him to the floor. The noxious odor that plagued them the previous night still lingered heavily in the house. After an hour passed, Mr. Scott regained some composure and recounted a horrifying encounter with an inexplicable and ghastly visage. Without hesitation, he and his wife swiftly gathered their sleeping children and fled into the darkness of the night. The following day, they moved in with Mrs. Scott's parents in another area of the city. Acknowledging defeat, the Scott family abandoned their home, leaving behind the sinister presence that dwelled within. Last year, my company held a New Year's Eve party in the city. When the party was over, I left to catch the last train home that night. I sat down in my seat and gazed out the window as the city lights flashed by. After a while, I saw that the only other person in the carriage was a man in a black trench coat. He was sitting a few rows in front of me and his head was hanging down. He appeared to be dozing off. I was quite sleepy too, and my eyelids started to feel very heavy. It wasn't long until I began to doze off. A few minutes later, I was jolted awake by the rattling of the train. When I opened my eyes, something seemed different. I wasn't sure, but it seemed as if the man in the black trench coat was one seat closer to me. I thought I was just imagining things and told myself not to be so paranoid. Not long afterwards, I began to doze off again. After a few seconds, I got a strange and unpleasant feeling in the pit of my stomach. I opened my eyes, and this time, the man seemed to have moved even closer. Still, I couldn't be sure, but it was extremely unsettling. I decided to try and see if my suspicions were correct. My plan was to pretend to fall asleep again, but keep one eye half open, just to see what the man would do. He just sat there, not moving a muscle. I could feel his eyes staring at me, but he didn't budge an inch. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, I heard him muttering something under his breath. Listening closely, I could make out what he was saying over and over. "Don't be fooled. She's just pretending. Don't be fooled. She's just pretending." It made my blood run cold. My heart started pounding in my chest. Despite being scared out of my wits, I kept my head down, pretending to doze off and desperately hoping that the train would soon reach the next station. When it finally stopped and the doors opened, I bided my time and waited for the right moment. Just as the doors were about to close, I scrambled out of my seat and jumped onto the platform. I heard the doors shut behind me and turned around. As the train pulled out of the station, I saw the man in the black trench coat standing up, his face pressed against the window. There was a look of fury on his face and, in his hand, a glistening knife. Ever since then, I never take the last train home. One night, a young woman arrived home late from work. Placing her handbag on the kitchen table, she began rummaging through it. It was then that she realized her mobile phone was missing, unable to recall when she had it last. Thinking she might have lost it on her way back, she proceeded to the hallway, picked up the home phone, and dialed her mobile number. After several rings, someone finally answered. "Hello?" the woman uttered. There was no response, but she could clearly hear someone breathing on the other end. "Hello? Can you hear me?" she inquired. "Hello? Can you hear me?" the woman repeated. Then, in a hushed tone, the person on the other end confirmed. "I hear you." Suddenly, the call dropped. Despite her persistent attempts to reach out by calling back, there was no answer. Eventually, feeling exasperated, she gave up. As it was already late, she decided to retire for the night. Upon entering her bedroom, she was taken aback to find her mobile phone resting on the nightstand. To her horror, it was set to silent mode. A farmer had a daughter for whom he cared more than anything on earth. She fell in love with a farmhand named David, but the farmer didn't think David was good enough for her. To keep them apart, he sent her to live with her uncle on the other side of the country. Soon after she left, David got sick and he wasted away and died. Everyone said he died of a broken heart. The farmer felt so guilty about David's death, he couldn't tell his daughter what had happened. She continued to think about David and the life they might have had together. One night, many weeks later, there was a knock on her uncle's door. When the girl opened the door, David was standing there. "Your father asked me to get you," he said. "I came here on his best horse." She packed a few things and they left. She rode behind him, clinging to his waist. But soon he began to complain of a headache. "It aches something terrible," he said. She put her hand on his forehead. "Why, you're cold as clay," she said. "I hope you're not ill." And she wrapped her handkerchief around his head. They traveled so swiftly that in a few hours they reached the farm. The girl quickly dismounted and knocked on the door. Her father was startled to see her. "Didn't you send for me?" she asked. "No, I didn't," he said. She turned to David, but he was gone, and so was the horse. So they headed over to the stable. The horse was there. It was covered with sweat and trembling with fear, but there was no sign of David. Terrified, her father told her the truth about David's death. He then went to see David's parents. They decided to open his grave. There lay the corpse of David in its coffin, but around his head they found the girl's handkerchief. One night, a father and his daughter were driving down a deserted country road. They were returning home after spending the entire day visiting the girl's mother in hospital. Listening to the sound of the rain drumming on the car roof, the girl began to doze off. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. The father struggled with the steering wheel, but the car skidded off the wet road and slammed into a stone wall. After checking that his daughter was uninjured, the man got out of the car to survey the damage. Both of the front tires had large punctures, and the right fender was crumpled against the wall. The rest of the car had survived unscathed. "We must have driven over something on the road. Whatever it was, it blew out both of the front tires." "You can fix it, right?" asked his daughter, somewhat shaken by the accident. "No," replied her father, shaking his head. "I've only got one spare in the boot. I'll have to walk back into town and find somebody to tow the car. It isn't that far from here. You wait in the car while I get some help." "Okay," she said reluctantly, "but please don't take too long." The man could see in his daughter's eyes that she was frightened. "Sit tight," replied her father as he shut the door. "I'll be back as soon as possible." His daughter watched him in the rearview mirror as he trudged off down the road in the pouring rain and disappeared into the night. More than an hour passed and her father still had not returned. The girl began to wonder what was taking him so long. She began to get increasingly worried as more time passed. Just then, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure in the distance walking towards the car. At first, she thought it was her father, but when she turned around to take a closer look, she realized that it was a strange man. He was dressed in overalls and had a big bushy beard. He was carrying something large in his left hand, swinging it back and forth. Something about him made her very nervous. As he approached, she stared out the back window and squinted her eyes. In the dim light, she could just make out what he was clutching in his right hand. It was a big, sharp butcher's knife. Thinking quickly, the terrified girl locked the doors of the car, then jumped into the back seat and hid. When she looked up again, she saw the strange man had stopped in his tracks and seemed to be staring directly at her. Suddenly, the man raised his arm and the girl let out a blood-curdling scream. In his left hand, he was clutching her father's head. She just kept screaming and screaming. Her heart was pounding and she was struggling to breathe. The grotesque expression on her father's face was horrifying to behold. His mouth was hanging open and his eyes were rolled back in his head. When the man reached the car, he shoved his face right up against the window and glared at her with crazed, bloodshot eyes. His hair was wild and matted with dirt. His face was covered in deep scars. For a moment, he just stood there in the driving rain, grinning at her like a madman. Then he reached into his pocket, took something out, and slowly lifted his left hand. In his hand were her father's car keys. That's all for this episode of Scary Bedtime Stories. I hope you enjoyed, and if so, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.